Well, hello, YouTube. Let's see here. It is now a couple of months since I've posted anything about the amplifier, and that's because, well, I finished it, and it's been so much fun listening to it that I really haven't been, couldn't be bothered to make a follow-up video, frankly. So here it is, power supply on the left, amplifier on the right. Starting with the power supply, which was largely made by hand. I mean, the whole thing was largely made by hand, although the amplifier itself has some CNC work for the aluminum panel, whereas this one was completely handmade. What we have here is in the back, we have 9 6AU4 rectifier tubes. They're damper tubes. We've got 4 and 4 for the main high voltage rectification. So parallel full wave bridge, and then a single half wave for the bias supply. Up front here we have some OD3s and a single OA3, 2 OD3s per channel. Each of those pairs provides a stabilized 300 volts for the screen grids. The single OA3 provides a stabilized 75 volt for the bias. We have 2 gigantic chokes, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 Henry or something like that. And some electrolytics. There's also more inside the chassis. Some of the electrolytics are in series and have high voltage on the cans as a result of that. So those are mounted inside so that they can't shock you. Back here, we have a big bank of oil capacitors, some Sangamos, 10 microfarad at 1500 volts DC. These only ever see, what's the main transformer here puts out 630 volts or so at around 1 amp. So those Sangamo caps don't see anywhere near 1500 volts, even on the peaks. Back here, 6.3 volt, 30 amp filament transformer. No center tap, unfortunately. Back here, another auxiliary filament transformer. This one has a center tap. And the bias supply transformer is inside the chassis. Back here, one of the cool features that I love about this amp, well, I mean, anybody can do this to their amp, but it's an hour counter, an industrial hour counter. Very, very cool for tracking the usage you're putting on your tubes and so on and so forth. All right, so moving right along. Oh well, before we go on, I should say that one of the problems I'm having right now is that both the end bells on this choke and the coil itself are mechanically vibrating. And so I'm going to have to take this choke apart and see if I can figure out some way to dampen everything down. Or flat out replace that. Hope it doesn't come to that. It's a nice new old stock part. It works quite well apart from buzzing. Moving right along to the amplifier itself. 4 KT90s per side. It's got enough filament current available to where you could run KT120s if you wanted to. Haven't really thought about running 150s. I'm not sure what the point would be. The output transformers are Harman Kardon Citation 2. Very, very, very good iron. Incredible bandwidth. From the very, very upper frequencies to very, very taut, in control, present bass. And interstage transformers, Lundahl 1660s. I believe they're the 10 milliamp version. I can't remember. They might be I can't remember off the top of my head. I have to check the sheet. Oh, the drivers, 6S and 7s. In this case, old stock tongue saws. These 2 tubes here, the 6DG8 and the OB2, are only for the metering circuit, for specifically the AC metering functions. Over here we have variable feedback control for each channel, and it's a stepped attenuator. and so you can very precisely set your feedback and match the setting on each channel. For certain modes of certain modes like pentode mode specifically, more than a certain amount of feedback will kind of result in an instability, and there's this little LCR circuit that can take that instability out, and you just kick it on like that if you want to use above a certain amount of feedback when you're in pentode mode. Other than that, you can leave that circuit out. Input attenuation, ladder style stepped attenuator. And moving right along, all of the tubes, all of the output tubes obviously are independently bias adjusted via 10-turn precision pots with position counters and locking clutches. Position counters are kind of cool. You can mark the position. These pots are very linear, so you can keep track of the numerical value of your bias setting. It doesn't necessarily correspond to bias voltage or anything, but it does have a fairly linear relationship. So over time, if you keep track of what it takes to bias your tubes up over time, as you have to adjust that as the tubes age, you'll be able to plot a curve of how your tubes are aging based on that, which is interesting. And of course, the little locking clutches are nice for keeping those from getting accidentally turned. What do we have here? So, 6 major modes of operation: 3 push-pull, 3 single-ended. Pentode 100 watt is probably the most powerful, followed by ultralinear 100 watt, and then triode 50 watt. These are rough output figures, probably a little bit conservative. And then the single-ended modes. Now it's not exactly a proper single-ended amplifier, in the sense that these aren't really single-ended transformers, and there's only a certain amount of reconfiguration you can do with a knob. But nevertheless, it's an interesting sound. It's low power. Definitely need some efficient speakers if you want to get the most out of that. Surprisingly, I've noticed that the biggest thing that the single-ended changes, since you can pop back and forth between it, it really changes the sound stage, which is surprising. I wouldn't have expected that. So the rest of it is all of the built-in metering. This thing basically has its own built-in VTVM, so you don't have to get your probes out and take your life in your hand poking around inside this thing to take basic measurements. The other thing is that these weigh like 100 pounds each. Getting inside of them is no small task, so it really does help to be able to take the bulk of your day-to-day measurements. Obviously, cathode bias measurements, your main power supply voltages, and then you can activate your AC metering functions. That still needs a little debugging. I've got a few glitches in that, but anyway, you can look at your power output, your driver voltages, so on and so forth. You can also use a test signal, which is switchable right here at the back by the inputs. Each channel has this switch available, and what that does is that just takes 6.3 volts right off the filament and it injects it into the input. That's very, very useful for a couple things. Number one, you can gain match your channels of your input tubes. The circuit is somewhat sensitive to the gain of the input tubes, so the 6SN7s have to be fairly well matched from side to side, or you will have a gain difference between the left and the right channel. So you can just simply hook your meter up to the speaker outputs and kick those voltages in, and then bring up some volume and just measure from one side to the other and make sure that your balance is good. It's very useful for that. Also good for positioning speakers for bass response, and so on and so forth. The rest of the switches are for the metering and for calibrating them. And that's about all there is to say about that. So I'm trying to discourage my cat from climbing up. He really wants to climb on this thing right now. Don't you dare. Don't you dare. All right. So let's fire it up. Not much point in really playing any music through it, honestly, just to deal with YouTube's copyright nonsense. So it's upside down, but there's what, 819.6 hours on this amplifier so far. And there we go. First the bias kicks in. Once the bias kicks in, it engages the safety circuit. The safety circuit then turns on the high voltage. That has two purposes. There's a large umbilical cord connecting. There's a large, yeah, there it is down there, military spec umbilical cord that, you know, connects these two things. And if you were to unplug it, that would be a bad thing. You wouldn't want one end of that cord to be sitting there with, you know, 550 volts DC on it. So the amplifier automatically shuts down the high voltage if that cord gets unplugged. And it also shuts down the high voltage if the bias supply fails. That keeps your tubes from melting down. So these are the OD3s. And my camera is doing a pretty crappy job of showing it, but these are less pink and more kind of violet. They show up as kind of pinkish peach on the camera, but they're more violet. So there we go. Tubes are warming up, and if we take a look at our metering here, let's take a look at the cathode current. It's coming up. I have them set for about 50 milliamps each, which is, you know, the meter at half deflection, and they're slowly coming up for each channel. And yeah, there's not much more to show you other than, you know, I guess I could hook it up to test equipment and show you its power output and its frequency response, and so far I'm pleased with both. But as far as playing it, like I said, not much point. I'll just get a copyright deal from you know who, and that'll be that. So and if we get close to this choke, you can hear the buzzing coming from that choke. So I have to deal with that and a couple of issues in the AC metering. But other than that, works really, really, really well. Very, very beefy 100 watts. Lots of capacitors in this thing. It's very, very, very easy and able to handle large dynamic peaks. You definitely don't hear any signs of the power supply bogging down, which is very cool considering it's all tube rectified. You typically don't think of a tube rectified setup as having a lot of dynamic response in its power output profile, and is typically prone to a lot of voltage sag when demand gets high. But this amp will go into clipping well before the voltage starts to actually sag, so it's definitely got all the beef it needs and a lot of response. Anyway, that's about it for now. I guess I have to tend to my cat again. All right, bye bye everyone.